The demolition of common nondescript buildings can be done using mechanical methods or controlled explosions, typically to have them implode. Depending on the size of the building and the structural system, manual removal, wrecking ball, and explosives can be used to demolish a building. Historic demolition, also known as dismantling or historic salvaging, is considered a more surgical approach to address buildings with significant architectural details, historic significance and value. Instead of a pile of rubble and debris, historic dismantling allows for the capture of the building parts. In 1966, the demolition of New York City's Pennsylvania station was mechanically demolished. It was also a tragic event which led to the establishment of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, tasked with saving the historic legacy of New York City. St. Paul's main village should certainly be considered for historic dismantling, wherein salvaged building elements can be reused for other purposes or for restoration of the building. There is a clear distinction between historic demolition and mechanical demolition. The difference being dismantling requires careful salvage of the historic building parts for repair, reuse, repurposing, or recycling, and use of a wrecking ball does not. Moreover, once the building is decontaminated and ready for demolition, site safety requires adjacent areas to be closed and continuous air monitoring to be conducted. On a smaller scale, I've included photographs of a project, my firm executed as an example of historic demolition or dismantling of an Upper West Side landmark apartment building. The photograph shows the before and after, as well as the process of tagging, repair, and restoration of glazed terracotta details. I'll go through the slides slowly now, just to point out some of the details. So this is the terracotta that's damaged. See all the cracks? See the cracks of terracotta? Next. You hear me now? Yeah. Excellent. So here you can see the terracotta. It's a little damaged. Continue. Next. So this is a parapet. Now here's a piece about to fall off. You probably hurt someone on the street. Next. Now you can see these little tags. This is what we mean by tagging the pieces of the building. So each piece gets a number, and this is called mapping. Mapping can be done manually or using laser technology. Next. This is a sample of the terracotta work that we were restoring. It's called a flamboyant style. Next. Here you can see more construction. All the pieces are still tagged. Continue. Notice there's a tag at each one of the blocks. And they're tagged, so one piece can be tagged in 4 or 5 different locations, so we don't lose. If you lose a tag, we still know where it goes. Next. You can see the tag. Continue. So all these pieces of the building are salvaged and taken down. Continue. So it's a graveyard of pieces right now. Next. And then we begin the restoration process and the repair. Next. That's a finished piece. Next. Another finished drawing. These are all being finished. Next. And you can start seeing the amount of terracotta in this building is quite enormous. It's a 12-story building. The parapet has both a flamboyant style and a tremendous detail throughout the facade. Next. These are pieces that have been restored and put back in place. Finished pieces. We showed the shop before, and now we have a finished piece. You get the idea? Continue. So you can see the amount of decorative details. Some of it obviously more decorative than St. Paul. Next. All the story. before completed. Next. Next. And this building is covered with storage. As you can see, the storage was meant is done with great care and purpose. Erecting wall and mechanical demolition removes the building from the site, so the site can be used to support a new structure, but be left as a landscape to be developed. The landscape concept plan that we present this evening will illustrate how the St. Paul site can be potentially used. Frank?
Thank you, Cosmo. And welcome everyone to our fourth town hall focusing on demolition. Thank you for taking the time in the middle of the week to join us. My name is Frank McDonough. I'm the chairman of the Mayor's Committee on St. Paul's to justify or review the uses that are available at St. Paul's. And we've done that in three previous town halls. First, in June, we took a look at all the historic uses that had happened over the last 30 years and made sure that everyone in the community had a chance to view what their predecessors and residents had said. Second, we had a chance to look at adaptive reuse and how some of those processes could be installed in a reused building. And then a week or so ago, we had a facade discussion in which we reviewed the engineering and architectural process of removing most of the building, putting a new building behind the facade, and then using that building for essentially three purposes. One, all of the same purposes that would have been in an adaptive reuse building. So adaptive reuse and facadism are almost identical. And then there's two other cases that we did last week where we talked about using them for a recreation center behind, which has been previously suggested. And then a third case in which we looked at facadism where we had a covered turf field and then an adjoining performing arts center. So tonight, it's demolition. Demolition in Garden City actually has a long history. If you go back in our history, you know we've demolished the original McKinley Library. We've demolished the Garden City Hotel. We've demolished St. Mary's. So there is no question, a sense within our village, that demolition is a viable and important alternative. So in running the Programmatic Use Committee, when we first gathered in January, we made sure that everyone on the committee knew that demolition was to be treated as it should, with respect, and a full and complete review of what the option really entails. You're going to hear some of that tonight. You may have heard some of it a week ago when we had partial demolition on facadism, and our friends at Thornton Tomasetti went into great detail on that. Unfortunately, they were called to a final presentation this evening, and so they are not with us. But I encourage you to take a look at the video we have posted on Thornton Tomasetti, in which we discuss the engineering, the architectural, and the practical aspect of partial demolition, because that actually applies in a great deal here. So, as we began the process of evaluating demolition, that process began in January, at our very first meeting. At our first meeting, we reviewed with all 8 of our committee members their preferences. We all agreed that demolition required a certain respect, and we began the process of investigating that. What did that entail? What that entailed was outreach to multiple demolition contractors and engineers. Some were quite willing to be with us, and we had several meetings in front and around the facility. Some really only want to talk by phone. But the multiple meetings that we had were run by John Martin, who is home sick tonight. But I want to thank John publicly for all the hard work that he did. So contractors have come in, given us their view on total demolition, and we began the process of making sure that that all of that will be documented. What's going to happen tonight? So based on the 10 months of work we've done on demolition, partial and complete, we're going to show you what would happen if we were to choose that demolition. Don't forget that in 2011, we had a vote in town. And demolition, total demolition, received a substantial number of votes, approximately 1,000. That was not the prevailing or the plurality, but it showed that people had a real and abiding interest in demolition. We treated that interest with respect, and you'll hear more of that tonight. So what will you hear? Number one, you're going to hear what would happen if we demolished. How many were here when the hotel was demolished? How long after the hotel was demolished did they take up every bit of topsoil and every tree on the site? Remember that? How long was that pit open? A long time. It was over 10 years. That's not going to happen here. So what we have said is, if there is demolition, there must be a plan for after demolition. We're not going to be left with a hole. Now, since the 1970s, various environmental laws and rules have come into effect. You're going to hear about that soon. But what we have done, even though the proponents of demolition who have been part of our committee said no thank you when we offered them engineering support, said no thank you when we offered them financial support, said no thank you when we offered them other kind of support to publish their view on demolition. So they're going to have their own discussion. They did not want to discuss that with the committee. God bless them. What you will hear tonight, however, is what the committee decided would be an appropriate landscape plan by a noted landscape architect. He will review that in detail. We will then talk about the legal issues associated with getting to that landscape plan. What is the process required by various environmental laws, local statutes, to bring the demolition to fruition? Then we're going to talk about the act of demolition. Cosmo has had some discussion on his view on demolition. This is different. This is if you brought in professional demolition folks and said, how do we do that? What is the impact of demolition not only on the building and surrounding area, on the traffic? What will it do in terms of the field? What is the environmental aspect of any potential hazardous material in the building? These are things that we will discuss with you tonight. There is no question that we are not willing to answer or research for you and come back. So I want you to be aware that over the 10 months that we have studied total demolition, as well as partial demolition, we have been to any number of different contractors, and we will discuss what we see as the path forward should the community, the residents, choose demolition. So I'd like to introduce our landscape architect, Bill Gould, who is noted and well respected, particularly for work that he's done around the village. And I can't thank you enough for coming out on a Wednesday night to join us and add your voice to the discussion on the future of St. Paul. Thank you very much. Will?
Thank you, Frank. Well, this is sort of the overall site plan, and this is just, I just put this up here to indicate this is where the St. Paul's is, and this is the basic site that we looked at to create a potential park. Next. This is a CAD drawing that I have a follow-up drawing which has more detail, but in exploring this, we felt that it was important to create, I mean, we have a very active park or area surrounding the rest of this. We felt that this was a real opportunity to sort of create a nice little passive park that had some highlight experience as you walk through. This would be a water feature here, a pond. Oh, okay, good. And then these would be various pathways that you can stroll through. These open areas here, you'll see the next plan has landscaping, but these could be areas where people could just have picnics, could sit, just hang out. And then there is a little activity over here. This would be a preschool play area because we don't have a facility like that in town. And this could be potentially just horseshoes or bocce courts here, purposely kept away from the busy street and active areas over there. So primarily this is meant to be a passive area, and this, we can go into the next one now. Oh, sorry, it's so dark. But the idea is, you can see, he's try to create a landscape. A lot of these gardens in here, these little understory plantings, as you go around, those could be various displays of wildflowers or native plant materials to add some extra interest in educational opportunities as you walk through. But you can see these lawn areas have been kept open for potential areas to hang out. Also, additional parking was added here and down here, so that it would provide instant, easy access to the site. And again, this pond area, this feature, was located because this actually would be the East L of St. Paul's, and this is about halfway across the building here. So if demolition goes ahead, there's going to be a pit here. And I felt that this was a perfect spot to locate something because you wouldn't have to do all the excavation. From a remediation standpoint, I don't know what the environmental issues might be, so that might be a consideration that has to be investigated before this could go in. But this could all be lined so that it would prevent any kind of pollution from any of the remains of the St. Paul's building. And it would provide a great opportunity. This little island was put here. I mean, if we put a pond in here, I'm sure we're going to have ducks and geese showing up. So this is a place that they could be. There's little overlooks as you go around here, a whole series of little overlooks. So as you walk around, you can look into the pond. You can observe whatever wildlife it might incorporate. It might be koi fish, might be frogs introduced. But this could be a really nice little central focus point of this whole park that would provide a wide array of different opportunities. And then again, as you walk around, benches that are strategically located throughout so that it provides, you walk through, there's probably a little, I can't quite see this myself. Well, here's some benches here. If you're looking to see the little benches here, they're serious. And then there's bike racks that have been strategically located so that the people can ride their bikes to the park park and provide easy access to the overall experience here. What else? Clearly, this was an initial concept, but if we were going to proceed with any serious design here, obviously the input of the community would be very important to get an idea of the kind of programmatic or features they might like to incorporate in the park. This was really featured as a more passive park that would allow strolling, relaxing, and just hanging out there as a feature in the middle of town. But programmatically, based on doing the initial research as this project proceeded, we would certainly solicit the input of the community and find out what programmatically would be the preference of the different things that might be included within the overall park. But this was an initial idea to get the ball rolling, so to speak, and what might be provided here. And following up, I have a couple of previous projects I've done that had water features. So next. This is a project, Westmore Park in West Hartford, Connecticut. This was meant to be a sort of an environmental educational facility. The park has many trails. There's a whole wetlands down over in this area. There's an educational trail that you walk through and you can observe. Actually, they have beavers there and nesting. But this was meant to be sort of the main core area. And these were a series of little ponds. This is a higher area, and these ponds sort of went around and they came down to this greenhouse here. And these ponds were meant to be sort of, each one was designed to be environmentally significant, displaying different wildlife, plant material that would be indigenous to the native area up here. And that's what this was, a major This is the daylight of the Sawmill River, the Vanderbilt part in Yonkers, New York. And I don't know if any of you have been there, but this river originally was covered over. So we opened it up and created a whole bunch of little opportunities along each side of the river. This is a little area that they have a fence and different displays. There's another area that has an amphitheater. We introduced a series of waterfalls to help aerate the water and create a feature. And this has been a very, very successful key component in downtown Yonkers now. Next. And this is a more passive kind of water feature that was introduced and made a major feature of the overall plan. This is the natural gas pipeline headquarters in Houston, Texas. And this pond around is surrounded by a series of pathways. So the employees there, lunch hour or anytime they wish, can walk around. There's sitting areas scattered. But this became a major focal point, and all the buildings are strategically located around the edge. There's a very nice buffer area around the whole water feature area, so it creates a nice setting. And people looking out of the office see this nice landscape area. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Say all right.
Thank you. I hope you all heard in the course of the discussion reflection on different parts of the country in which he has practiced. He's not Frederick Olmsted, but he's our Frederick Olmsted. So one of the things that we actually talked about, we didn't want to confuse the discussion, but it would be certainly something up for public discussion, and we'd love to hear your voices on this. Remember, Garden City is the largest natural prairie east of Iowa. The several thousand acres that was purchased by Alexander Stewart were originally prairie land created by the glaciers that went through here millennia ago. And we actually could consider whether or not we would want to have, on an environmental basis, a park or part of a park that would reflect the natural plants that used to grow here. And whether or not we could begin that, or whether or not we could begin talking about two kinds of trees that used to dominate Garden City, the American chestnut and the American elm. So the potential for this is limited only by the imagination of the residents. Now, in order to get there, there's a legal process that we have to undergo. And Brendan Moody, who is with Cullen and Dykeman, will talk to us about that and how we get to the point where, after a vote in favor of demolition, we would then be able to begin the process of moving toward exactly this kind of terrific park. And to reiterate what Bill said, we obviously would have an enormous amount of outreach to the community to talk about what kind of a park is there. Does it have to be like the rest of the athletic field? Could it be an environmental situation? Could it be an educational location? So there are lots of opportunities here. Again, subject only to your imagination. But let's get to the legal issues now, please. Brendan Moody.
Everyone hear me?
No.
So, as Frank mentioned, my name is Brendan Mooney. I'm an attorney with the law firm Cullen Dykeman. And we have been
Can't
asked,
hear you.
we've been asked to provide advice to the village regarding the environmental review that would be required for the St. Paul's project, regardless of whether demolition is pursued, or façadism, or reuse. And so the reason I'm here this evening is to provide the residents with information on the environmental review. And in particular, what I'd like you to walk away with is really two things. It's a better understanding of the process that's involved and the timing associated with that process. So let me begin first with, what is the environmental review? What am I talking about? What I'm talking about is the review that's required in the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which I'll refer to as SEQR. What SEQR requires is that municipal agencies, municipal boards, like the village board, take a hard look at the potential environmental consequences of actions that they intend to either fund, approve, or undertake themselves. And so for that reason, regardless of what option, what alternative is pursued for St. Paul's, those options would be subject to seeker review. So very early on in the seeker review process, the village would have to make what's called a significance determination. And that's a fundamental part of the process. And what the law asks the village to do is answer this question. Will the project, as proposed, result in potential significant adverse environmental impact? And if the village determines, as part of its review, based upon the information that it has, that the project would not result in significant environmental impact, then what it does is issue what's called a negative declaration. And that essentially ends the environmental review for that project. On the other hand, if the village was to determine that the project as proposed would result in significant environmental impact, what would happen is the village would be required to prepare an environmental impact statement. And that's significant because the preparation of an environmental impact statement in and of itself requires a lot of additional process and a lot of additional time. And so I'll talk about that a little bit now. What's involved in the preparation of an environmental impact statement? The first thing that the village would have to do is go through what's called a scoping process. The village would work with a consultant to develop what's called a draft scope. And that draft scope essentially outlines, it frames out what would be included in the environmental impact statement. Now that draft scope is provided to the public, and the village would solicit input on the draft scope and feedback on the draft scope. For instance, members of the public might say, I think that we should look at visual resources as part of the environmental impact statement. I think we should look at historical resources as part of the environmental impact statement. So then the village would take that feedback and it would prepare what's called a final scope. And then that would serve as the framework and the outline for what would become the draft environmental impact statement. Now the draft environmental impact statement, again, is prepared by the village's consultant, and it covers a number of things. It provides a description of what the project would be. It provides a description of the environmental impacts associated with the project. It talks about alternatives that were considered by the village, and it talks about mitigation measures that were considered to reduce the potential environmental impact. So after the draft environmental impact statement is prepared, that is then made, again, available to the public to review and to provide comment on and to provide feedback on. So once the draft EIS is then put out for public comment and review, what the village would do is consider those comments, consider the feedback, and that would be incorporated into what's called the final environmental impact statement. And it's only then, after the final environmental impact statement is prepared, that the village would be in a position to then move forward with whatever the proposed project is. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I just talked about quite a bit of process. So what is the timing associated with that process? Well, here we have the benefit of looking back at the environmental process that was followed back in 2009, when the village was considering demolition of St. Paul's. Back then, the seeker process began in the spring of 2009, and then it culminated with the issuance of a final environmental impact statement in February of 2011. So there, it was a 2-year process, about a 2-year process. And I'm not saying that the process this time would take just as long, but it could. It could be shorter, it could be longer. Just want to give folks a sense of what the process involves in terms of time. So we talked a bit about the 2009 environmental impact statement, and that obviously begs the question, well, if we already went through the secret process and we already prepared the EIS, if we were to pursue demolition again, couldn't we just reuse the the 2009 EIS? And the answer to that question is it depends. But the village would have to look at what has changed between 2009 and 2022. Is the action, is the proposed project the same now as what was proposed back then? Have things changed around St. Paul's? The community around St. Paul's, has that changed? And should we look at those changes when we're considering the environmental impact? Or are there different circumstances? Have there been new rules, regulations, or policies that are in effect that should be considered as part of the environmental review? If there are changes that have occurred, then the village may want to consider whether either a new EIS, a new environmental impact statement should be performed, or whether a supplemental environmental impact statement should be performed. And if a supplemental environmental impact statement is required, it's a similar process to the EIS process I described before, except that scoping, that early on process, that's optional. So that would be a slight change potentially in the process that would be required. But again, the village would want to look back at the 2009 EIS, take a look at what has changed, and then determine whether a supplemental EIS would be required. So we've talked about a number of things tonight in terms of the process that could be required, either a negative declaration, which would finish the environmental review because no potential for significant adverse environmental impact. We've talked about the EIS process, which again could be, back in 2009, it extended through 2011. It was almost a 2-year process. And then there's a supplemental EIS process, which again, it's very similar to the EIS process, but could scoping. So this is all important in terms of the various options that the village is considering, and for the residents to consider, in terms of, again, the process that would be involved and the timing that would be associated with it. And then obviously the other thing when it comes to timing is the potential for litigation. If there's litigation, someone were to challenge the secret review, that would further extend the time frame associated with the environmental review process. So that concludes my remarks, and Frank will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Brendan. I hope everyone got a beginning feel for what the legal process is. Many of us have had experience with it or at least read about these kind of processes. But let's stay on the issue at hand. The village has decided that demolition is the preferred option. We've moved through the process of SEQRT, the State Environmental Quality Review Act. We've moved through the draft EIS to a final EIS. And now we have to begin the process. Well, one interim step. You then have to have a general obligation vote to pay for the demolition. Once you move through that, now we're at the point where we have to be thinking, how is this demolished? And because of the nature of the building and how it was constructed, there are very specific engineering issues and then very specific construction issues. Remember, this is a building in the middle of a playground. This is a building in the middle of athletic fields and across from a school. So we need to be careful in terms of how that is done, and in particular how that impacts traffic in one of the busiest areas in the village, and how that would be pursued. But first let's talk about the engineering aspect, and then we'll also talk about the architectural. Again, apologies from Thornton Palmacetti because of their command performance out of state. You are welcome to join or look at our website where their remarks on partial demolition from last week would be equally applicable here. But we have Joe DeFore, who will be speaking about the engineering aspect, and of course we have our own mayor, Cosmo, who can talk to a certain extent on the architectural aspect. Joe? When Joe and Cosmo finish, we will then open up for questions before we close the evening.
Once it gets to the point where the building does come down, it'll be a pretty big task. The surrounding area will have to be isolated. The field will be restricted, depending on the time of the year, the air will be monitored monitored in the surrounding areas will be an ongoing process. Contrary to any thoughts about demolition, this is not going to come down with a wrecking ball. Nowadays, when they demolish buildings, they have to be done surgically, not just for historical purposes, but also for mixing of materials, removing from the site. Timber has to be separated from the brick, brick has to be separated from other elements. It's done very, very surgically. It becomes an arts and crafts project, and it takes time, and it takes money. The trucks that'll be in and out of the village will be quite extensive. It'll take probably in the area of several months, give or take, whoever the contractor may be, and it'll be quite involved. It will be a process you've never seen in your life before. I've had that experience where I have seen it. And nowadays, it's just much more restricted from an environmental standpoint because they do limit what you can remove in one truck, where you could send it, how it gets disposed. It's a big process. Demolition today costs approximately 3 times what it would have 10 years ago. That being said, when the site is completely demolished, they'll have to deal with what's below grade. That'll involve heavy equipment, digging, trenching, removing, separation of materials, and more trucks and more heavy equipment. And it'll really be a little bit of a burden in that area for quite some time. When it's all said and done, turn over the landscape or whatever the future use may be, but it will be a process that everyone will have to live through, and it will cost some money. That's pretty much it.
John. I'm going to give you a perspective from an architect's point of view, and there might be some redundancy in the SECRA application process, but I'll give it to you from our perspective as architects. Demolition of St. Paul's main building requires several steps to be accomplished. The building must be rid of any contaminated materials. An environmental review of the project in accordance with the New York State Quality Review Act, SECRA, must be conducted before any action can be taken. If demolition of the building poses no significant environmental impact to the surrounding site, then a negative declaration can be determined. However, if there is potential adverse environmental impact, then an environmental impact statement will be required, which will require issues such as the land, air, water, flora, fauna, noise, minerals, historic, archaeological, community character, and aesthetic concerns to be reviewed by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and other state agencies that may be involved. Initially, a draft environmental impact statement is prepared, and once it is determined to be acceptable, after notice for public review and comment, which may also require public hearings, the final environmental impact statement is then reviewed by each government agency involved, and a final decision is rendered. So before any plans are prepared to demolish St. Paul's, a thorough environmental impact analysis must be done. Demolition, as I have described in my opening comments, can take several forms depending on cost and the elements of the building to be salvaged. If it is agreed nothing is to be saved, then a wrecking ball can be used and the site cleared. However, if interior details, artifacts, and actual decorative stone facade features are to be saved, then careful removal is warranted using manual and less destructive methods. St. Paul's main building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the A.T. Stewart era of buildings. And with such a designation, the State Historic Preservation Office will be an agency who also involved in the review of the secret application. Again, they would address the historic issues of the application. So the demolition logistics can only be determined when the environmental scope of work, the amount of historic building elements to be saved, and associated costs are known. Demolition of St. Paul's main building can be done quickly, or it can be done with a careful plan to at least save the historic elements of the building to be restored or to be repurposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. One of the things that we have to recognize is that this building was constructed in a very different way. One of our contractors referred to it as a castle, a modern castle. What that means is larger bricks were at the base, and the bricks and the material was smaller as you went up the side of the building. And that was on the exterior facade, as well as in the interior facade. Now, As you move up that wall, because they were so high, particularly at that time, the walls were tied together. How many of you have gone by a home and seen them getting ready to put bricks on the front of a house, usually against a wood platform, and you see those little metal strips that come out from the wood? How many of you have ever seen that? Okay? Why is that? So the brick doesn't fall down. As they move up the wall, as the bricks get smaller, in this building, they did two things. Number one, they built internal bearing walls, load bearing walls. And then what they did is they used large timbers. Remember, this is the 19th century, 1800s, for those who and they connected the external wall to that internal bearing wall to create rigidity, strength, and support. That wood, over 100 years, became the kind of wood that they found at Notre Dame. It was more concrete than wood. But nonetheless, it creates such a rigidity between the external wall and the internal bearing wall that that has significant engineering impact in how and where and when the demolition would take place. So that's a critical aspect. Much of it would require hand labor rather than claw. But there could be some very significant parts that could be clawed down. It's a process that, as we've said in many of our other town halls, will take investigation further and will require additional input from the community. So what we've heard tonight is, A, there is a process involved. Number one, it starts with your input, and that comes with a vote. But hopefully that vote comes after some thoughtfulness, and we are open to any questions you have. We meet on Tuesday nights, and if you need more information, please join us at the Historical Society at 7 o'clock every Tuesday. We've met every Tuesday since at the end of June, and we will continue to do so until every voice is heard. If you have ideas on demolition, or if you don't like that park, if you have another idea for the park, we would be happy to hear that. This must be a community decision. Second thing we heard was that the park could be quite spectacular. Walking areas, ponds. We have one of the best landscape architects on the East Coast here, whose work we've seen all around the country. He's more than available to help us move to something that our community would work and would fit within our community. So the opportunity is the first step on envisioning what those 10 acres could look like, particularly in combination with the 40-odd acres, 48 acres behind it. Again, part of your choice. A walking path, a pond, something else. Third, we've heard on the legal side that it is a process, but this is a process that happens in any construction project. Unfortunately, what we've also heard is that the 2009 EIS may or may not have the impact that you would think it might, because of the change in time, the change in regulations, and also the change in the community. So here is the process. It begins and ends with residents. What would you like? If it's demolition, here is one idea. If you don't like the park and would like something else, we are open to present that to the rest of the residents. If we proceed either way, there will be a legal process, then a vote to pay for it on a general obligation basis, and then the actual act of demolition, which, as our engineers have said, could have impacts on the field, their availability, and the impact certainly on traffic. Those are considerations, but ultimately it's your choice, and we would love to begin to hear from you now. So if you have questions, please direct them to an individual, and we will address them quickly, and then we will close with Bruce Turner. Thank you. The floor is open. Yeah.
I heard that you can't use a wrecking ball, and then I heard the mayor say you can use a wrecking ball. So can you just clarify that, please?
I think the mayor's statement was really just in general, that he was coming to demolish the building, but I was trying to be specific as far as how it actually gets done, because you need to separate the materials to recycle them and dispose of them. So the wrecking ball basically, from the mayor, he can confirm this with me, speaking generally, he's saying, take it down and just demolish it, whether it's done by hand or we meant the same thing. But it has to be done surgically. It cannot be done where you just come in and demolish the whole thing. They separate all the materials. That's just the way it's done in these days. It used to be done the old way with the wrecking ball, but not anymore.
This is for council. You mentioned that if you have the supplemental process, it means that you don't have to do the scoping process. Is that correct?
If you're doing a supplemental environmental impact statement, the scope
Microphone.
is optional. You can do it if there are other
Microphone.
who wanted to go through that process, you could.
Okay. Now going back to the 2011 process, scoping was part of that process, correct? Can you ballpark how long that took, the scoping process at that time?
Scoping was a few months, I would say.
Okay. So you would save that period of time if you didn't need to do it when you're doing the supplemental. Is that correct?
Presumably, right, if the village was to do a supplemental and it didn't go through the scoping process, you would avoid those few months.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
As far as timing is concerned, if you have to do an environmental impact statement, you have to proceed from what has been done in the past, is that done after the building is building, get all the approvals, and then not?
That entire process is before the building comes down. That's all, it's all needed for the permit. When you ultimately get the permit, you have to go through all those hoops. And the New York State DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, is probably the toughest agency out of all of them. So even if the village does its due diligence, when we end up like the DEC, you could verify that gets to be the toughest part. But that all needs to be in place before the final permit is issued for demolition.
So we don't get that hole in the ground that we had for 10 years at the hotel waiting for all the approvals.
Right, you have the approval beforehand, but then remember, you then have to go to your village residents and ask them to approve a tax and a general obligation bond to finance that. Question? Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I have a question on demolition. So the idea of historic demolition versus mechanical demolition. Historical demolition is not required, correct? That is a choice that we make? Yes? Right? So, that's what I thought. Okay, so who would just, and that is much more extensive and much more time consuming and costly, correct? So who or how would it be decided which we do? Because speaking for myself, I'll only speak for myself, I acknowledge that there are certainly things of value, the Tiffany glass, the clock tower, et cetera, that's in there. I don't know that I would agree that ceramic tile is worth us spending an inordinate amount of time, et cetera, to save. So does it have to be all one or the other? And if yes, then who would decide it is historic demolition, which is a significantly greater cost than the other approach?
Let me explain a little further. In order to determine what artifacts are going to be saved, what pieces of the buildings need to be saved, we work with a building conservator, someone who has knowledge of the value of the historic pieces of the building, and then we would also work with the State Historic Preservation Office. Because the building is on the National Register, we would have to have discussions with them as well. So you would discuss what parts of the building you want to save, how you're going to save it, and then you start to catalog all these pieces somehow, and provide a specification for the contractor to make sure he can follow that specification exactly, to know what pieces he has to save, how he's going to save it, where it's going to be transported, et cetera, et cetera. So there's quite a bit of work to be done. And you do this only with experts that understand the pieces of the building.
But we don't have to to do that.
You don't, no, you don't have to do that. If the residents vote to just tear it down,
Yep,
there's a process. As you know, we use wrecking ball as a euphemism pretty much right now. So years ago, they did use wrecking balls. But what Joe before was saying was exactly correct. Building has to be taken down in a certain manner. It's required by Nassau County Code, New York State Code. We have certain things we have to follow in order to take the building down. But to do what we call historic demolition or historic dismantling or salvaging, you have to be much more precise. You have to understand what you're taking apart, how it's taken apart, because you don't want to disturb certain parts of the building and then have a collapse.
thank you.
Thank you.
There's another aspect to that, and although there is some choice there, one of the things that we are also looking at as a committee is that there are items in there of value, whether they're the Tiffany windows, or the ironwork, or the mitten tiles, or the acres of architectural woodwork, and whether or not it's to the advantage of the village to have them removed and taken and salvaged to our benefit. Because clearly, a salvage group will come in, offer to do a demo of some sort, recognizing that there is real value inside the building, take that out, demo it. But there are two other aspects here. Number one, the stonework also has considerable value. If you look around the windows, that has value. The brick, quite interesting, could be ground down and used in other construction sites. So a contractor coming in is going to look and say, I'll charge X for the demo, but I'm going to get 2, 3, multiple times X in what I can, resources I can. So part of our task is to allow you to understand what that could be, right? So that you can make a judgment as to the value or not of what that building is, both intrinsically and as material for fill or for aggregate they use in roads. There are a lot of different things that they do now that they didn't do 10 years ago. Okay? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a second question. Why is this presentation?
Can you come to a mic?
Got one?
The smartphone.
Why is this presentation so negative? And I'll use words like you guys used. You started off calling this a tragic event. You called it a hole in the ground. You cited traffic. You cited years of activity. Somebody cited there would be construction in the middle of the playground. We'd have to shut the fields down. Environmental impact statements. Am I missing something? These apply to all the alternatives. I've sat in on every briefing, and your level of enthusiasm for adaptive reuse was like free lunch for everybody, except it's not free. Let's build a theater, rent it out to other people. This is like, hole in the ground, environmental stuff. Why is this so negative? Why isn't this on par like the other alternatives?
Thank you for that. I'm sorry you feel that those are words. I did not use them. Well, we
You
did.
didn't use the word tragic event?
No, I did
Anybody hear the word tragic here?
not. You might have heard the word tragic event, sir. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me. Did I use the word tragic event?
I don't know. The mayor.
Oh, that's different.
I don't care.
No. I just want to make sure you were clear on where that voice came from. No, please, you're talking about. Talking about my reputation. What we have done here is we have taken one of the top landscape architects and shown what an opportunity is. We have one of the best legal voices in environmental and had a review of that process. If, as part of the introduction, the mayor, who is an architect and has said he has professional obligations concerning demolition, has used those words, please take that up with him. The committee has spent 10 months reviewing all of these options, and we have not at any time taken that view. If you remember my remarks, I said, this is a process that deserves the respect. That achieved 1,000-odd votes back in 2011 and has been done before. The hotel, St. Mary's, the library. Respect. Not negative. Respect. If that is not enough, I beg your pardon, please speak.
You say respect. When you talked about adaptive reuse, you didn't talk about how many years that would take. Here you talked about a hole in the ground. Well, you know what? Is there a fence around St. Paul's now? Isn't that the same thing as a hole in the ground? No. Except it's sticking up, not down?
No, a hole in the ground is a hole in the ground. Hole in the ground's a hole in the ground. A hole in the ground the size of the Garden City
Okay,
Hotel.
and construction,
Is a hole in the ground.
adaptive reuse or facadism will take less time than demolition?
No.
Okay, so if you're concerned, I didn't hear you express the fields would be tied up or out of service because we were doing facadism or any of this. You chose negative.
You're talking about trucks.
And trucks.
Huge rigs, non-stop. You're talking about air monitoring, pollution.
And you wouldn't have huge rigs coming in with facadism.
No.
Okay. Much slower. How long would adaptive reuse take?
Facadism is the equivalent of brainstorming.
How long would that take?
We can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Joe, do they have an idea?
Joe, use the mic over there, that mic.
Why do we have that?
Next question, please. Next question. And I'm not suggesting that words that you chose to write down were not used. I am suggesting I did not use that, and the committee, when we reviewed all of that since January, did not use that and never applied that standard to them.
To a great degree, I agree with the sentiments expressed by this gentleman. I want to point out, as far as I'm concerned, the processes and challenges across all three options are similar in one degree or another, in terms of disruption to the village, in terms of the location of the project, in terms of its proximity to the middle school, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's unfair to try and point out or mischaracterize, as I would interpret tonight, that this project, this consideration of demolition, somehow puts a greater burden on the village in all those aspects. However, at the end of the day, it comes down to cost. The fact that a garden or playground or some other use is being proposed is wonderful, but it need not be an integral consideration of the demolition project itself. We could also have just a field and vote subsequently on what to do with that space. And I don't think it ought to be tied in inextricably as one project. But at the end of the day, it's about cost. We want to know what the costs are on renovation, facadism, or demolition. And nobody here can make any kind of informed decision until we have those numbers.
If this, okay. So thank you for that. And if you may remember our remarks, we said this is the first part on demolition, and if there are thoughts on demolition, you are welcome to visit us on Tuesday night. Please remember what we also said, that from the very first meeting of our committee, we reached out to individuals who were proponents of demolition, asked for their opinion, asked and offered help so they could do that. To your question as to the landscape, absolutely right. If you wanted a field there or a playground, you could have that. But we thought, because we have playgrounds and fields around, what don't we have? Well, some people have come to us and asked for a walking park, so we put the walking park here. That was not something that we made up. It is your fellow residents saying it would be nice to have that. That's why we did that. If you feel differently, God bless you, from mine, I have to put that in as well. It isn't the committee's decision. The committee's decision is to generate conversation, see what they want. And actually, you're right. We're at close to the point where we need to have a sense of what these cost, what these alternatives are. It is not the committee's view as to what the timeline is. That comes from legal and engineering. If you have questions concerning their view on timeline, we can have them talk to that in detail. If you need more private time with them, we're happy to arrange that. Because we need to have a resident who are informed as to what the full cost is. So you're absolutely right on all your points. Okay? And Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, we'd be happy to see. Other questions?
Yes, I have a little mic in my head. My name is Bob Rosen. I'm a member of the Budget and Finance Committee, and my job, to say, that I took on is looking at the money, where it's going, and how it's being spent. And how it's being spent. Back in 2014, the village paid for the demolition of Ellis Hall, an 18,550 square foot building. The demolition at that time will cost $825,000, with $300,000 being reimbursed through an environmental grant from Nassau County. Can we get such a grant now if we decide to demolish St. Paul?
Well, that's a great question. And we would refer that to the committee to which you serve. But because you serve on it, we would be sure that we would look for federal, state, and local grants to defer any and all the costs. As you know, we tried to do when we repaired the roof. That was done just a few months ago. So absolutely any source of revenue, any source of capital that can be in there and defer the taxes and costs of residents, we would certainly look at. Yes.
Another quick question, abatement. Has that started? And which type of abatement will be doing? Will it be abatement with remediation, or just, which is abatement for reuse, or abatement just, in other words, the prelude to demolition? Because each one of them is different, and each one of them has a different cost.
The abatements that you're referring to, I would imagine you're talking about carcinogen, lead, asbestos, mold, things like that?
Correct.
There isn't much as far as asbestos is concerned in the building, because it was built prior to the use of asbestos. Lead would be in the paint, that would be removed. As far as mold and things like that, that would have to be abated also. All of the abatements will be dealt with before the building is removed.
Okay.
Because it has to be. It becomes an air monitoring situation. So that stuff, you do not want it to be airborne.
That's true, but abatement with remediation, in other words, to schedule it for reuse, means that if you have a wall full of mold, you take the wall down, and you put another wall up. If you use abatement with the foresight of demolition, you take the wall down and you leave it down, because there's no point putting another wall up, the whole building's going to disappear. I want to know which aspect the village is going to take.
Either way, it has to be abated. So you may not put that wall back if the plan doesn't call for the wall to go back. But theoretically, any abatement has to be dealt with before you do anything to the building. Anything.
I realize that. It's abatement or abatement with remediation. That's what I'm asking. Because one's more expensive than the other.
Well, yes, but it's also relative. You can't say that if you're going to demolish a building, you have to put the wall back. If you're going to remediate it, obviously you're going to put the wall back. But the point is that it has to be abated regardless. So that's a different assessment when it comes down to dollars and cents. You can't necessarily compare the two because we're going to demolish the building, we don't do a new building. You're just mixing the two, but the abatement part has to be dealt with regardless.
When does that begin?
It'll begin before any other work is taking place, whether it's facadism, whether it's adaptive reuse, whether it's demolition, it has to be dealt with initially.
When is it going to begin? Do you have a date?
I guess once every decision is made and we move forward, or the process.
This, the diamond, whatever, of the park, which I come to think is very nice. But do you have any idea what this would cost to create and maintain?
The issues on cost, Bob, as you know, because it's your committee, the issues on cost are after the decision, after we've had these meetings to describe what options there are. Before the Board of Trustees, there's a motion and a resolution to ask for a cost estimator. When we ask for a cost estimator, this is the first of many times that the cost would be evaluated. It's not a final cost, because these are not final plans. And as you know, if you sit on that committee, that you would then go through a process of looking at what the cost estimator has said. We would present that to the resident and say, here are what your options are. Think of it, Bob, like buying a car. Do you want a special package, a base package? Do you want a premium package? Do you want heated seats? If you do, many people have asked us, this is what that would cost. If you would rather just demolish the building and put grass seats and park benches there, that's an option, and so we would have to cost that out. If you would like a more fulfilled parkland, such as this landscape, we would estimate what that cost would be. If you would like a playground, we would have to estimate that. But again, it depends on what the residents are asking. That comes back to us, and then we would ask the cost estimator to do that. When we get that information, we would then present that to the village residents and say, here's what you asked for, here's what that costs. Do you still want that? And that begins the process of winnowing down many of the options we have. And you know that.
Well, as far as the estimator goes, and I go along with that, but I think what's holding this whole process up is that this village cannot hone in on what they want to do. There are so many things they want to do. And an estimator would be estimating for years, because they'd estimate this, they'd estimate for facadism, they would estimate this, they would estimate whatever. They have to come to some sort of idea as to what they want to do, so the guy can do his job. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is the historic designation that the building has the same designation that the Victorian homes have in the central section?
I don't know the answer, but I've just been told by the individual in the audience that the answer is yes. Good question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Should I be shouting? Because those have come down, and they don't have any protection. So I'm wondering if, the building has more protection from the federal government than the Victorian homes in the central section.
Let me address the subject of landmark status. Even though the St. Paul's and other buildings in the village are on the National Register, the village does not have a municipal law that protects these buildings. So all these buildings, even though they're listed on the National Register, can be torn down. That is a fact. And some of them have been torn down. So again, unless the village comes up with a law to protect these properties, they can all be taken down in the same point.
Good question. George.
With regard to cost, George, I think it should be emphasized.
We're going to get to the mic, so everyone can hear.
With regard to cost, I think it should be emphasized that demolition will be a small fraction of total development. Would the experts agree with that? And I'd like to know what their estimate would be of the reduced cost with demolition versus development.
George, I honestly didn't hear your question, so what about reduced cost and demolition?
I didn't,
You broke up.
I'll repeat the question.
we're talking about cost. And regarding the cost, I think the people should be told in advance that demolition will cost a small fraction of the cost of development. Much less.
And that's your point of view.
I'd like to know if you would agree with that, or the experts here would agree with it.
I would say, George, as we have said from the beginning, in this phase, we're talking about options for use. Demolition, facadism, adaptive reuse. The next phase is cost. I am not an expert in cost. I wouldn't know what the cost would be. But once we get them, those will be obviously presented to the community, and they can make that judgment. Our committee is not in the business of making judgments for the residents. Our committee, from the get-go, as you know, from the very first meeting, when we invited you to lead the effort on demolition, said, we are going to look at it in an even-handed way, present all of the options, which we've done tonight, and with the possible exception of it being a landscape field versus a unlandscaped park. I think you've now had an opportunity to see what the issues associated with demolition are. And as to cost, that would come with the cost estimate.
I have another question. How are you going to determine what the uses in the park will be?
Well, George, as we have done since the early part of the year, every Tuesday we've reached out to groups to come in and tell us what they think. And on an anecdotal basis, we've heard from any number of different groups, whether they be music or seniors or performing arts, as to what they think their needs are. And we would expect people who see demolition and are here tonight would be welcome at any of our Tuesday meetings to tell us what they think they would like to see in this spot. It is not up to us to do that. And so the other way to do that is what we presented to the Board of Trustees back in the late winter, early spring, you were there, where we said perhaps we should raise a survey of some sort. And the board is still considering that. So there are a lot of ways to do this. Without a survey to show actual data, we went through an anecdotal approach. We went through a historic review of every paper, every report, every newspaper, every letter, which you had several, that came on and said, this is how we'd like to see St. Paul done, and we categorized them, and it took around 4 or 5 months to do that. So we have a historical record of what residents of the last 30 years have said. We presented that in June at the first town hall, where we clearly indicated that this was a historical record, and people now knew on the baseline, for people who had not been here for 30 years, what their former residents had requested. And then we said, phase 2, if you'd like to come and visit us on Tuesday evenings, come tell us what you would like. Facade, demo, adaptive reuse. And we've made a catalog of those responses. Those are part of the process of coming up with proposals. We've had proposals where we've had to say no. People who wanted to do what some people call shared responsibility, to allow private use there, we've had to inform them that that's not even possible. We had others that wanted more elaborate issues, but we said we didn't think we would present them, such as an Olympic level pool. We're not going to present that. And so on all those bases, George, we made the judgment on what other people are telling us, and are things affordable, and that has guided us. But the final decision on what is affordable and what people want lies in this room and in the future.
Just to expand on, this whole process, we're trying to get information out so people can make decisions. And in essence, this is a placeholder design. It's not meant to be a final design. It's not meant to be, that it can't be changed. If this was the decision of the village that they decided this was the option they wanted to go with, it'd be an iterative process that we would go through to gather all the information, the ideas, and wishes that people would like to incorporate in this, and that's how the final design would evolve. This was meant to just show that this was a potential option that this space could be used for. So this isn't meant to be the final design.
And George, just so we're really clear, this concept of the pond and a walking path was presented to our committee by many of the seniors in the village who said we would like a quiet place to walk. This was not made up out of whole cloth. Everything we have put out to the community has been resident-based. Next question.
Tom, this is all. Question.
I just want to make sure that before you ask your third question or fourth, that there aren't any other questions that other people might like to raise.
I have a question.
Yes, John?
I've recommended a number of times, instead of demolishing the whole building, to demolish the wings. And it's different than any of the other options that you have available. But what it would do would provide the people who love the front of the building to continue to have the building, to get rid of almost 100 rooms which may or may not be useful with any kind of renovation internally. But we're also trying to do something which I think is crazy, and the reason why we haven't made a decision. We're trying to make two decisions at the same time. Demolition is demolition. It's not a park. You have said with your other proposal, the village really needs a theater. Where's the theater? Where's the basketball court? The problem is that whenever you come up with an option, you have two options. So people are going to say, if you put a theater in the middle of this, they might say, hey, that's great, that's what we want. If you put around your building that you're going to leave up a park, well, you have a park, but the people want the park. So my feeling is time to make a decision, one decision at a time. And if we want demolition, if people want to demolish the building, the question that I have is why? Why do we want to demolish the building? Is it a cost issue? Or is it an issue of the way it looks? If it's a cost issue, we can't make that decision because we don't have any cost information. If it's the way it looks issue, okay, so you don't like it, let's take it down. But the other thing that I feel is taking down the wings eliminates a lot of the issues that have been brought up tonight in terms of it's going to affect the fields. We're now taking down a very small part of the building. It's not that small. But it leaves what a lot of people love in this village is the beautiful front of the building. But I think presenting this to people is wrong. We're not demolishing and putting a park. No, we're demolishing. Don't put two things together, because every time you want to get a vote somewhere else, I can find people who want a theater, put a theater in here, and they'll vote for demolition. So be careful the way you present these things. This is not the way to present it. It should be one thing at a time.
Thank you, John. John has been involved in this process almost as long as I have, and we always appreciate his comments. Let me address a couple of them, please. Number one, in the facade discussion, we had a very specific discussion on taking down the wings, because that's what you would ask. That was presented. We call it the I case. Why? Because when you take down the building, if you'll notice, the building is in the shape of an E, right? Two wings and a central part with a long piece along Stewart Avenue. If you take down the wings and the chapel, which you suggested, you have what amounts to an I. Some people say, whoa, whoa, how about the tower? Okay. Option number two, you keep the I and the tower Now you have an L, right? We talked about that during the facade discussion. Third case, one of our leaders said, I want to take this down a gut renovation. Okay, all the way to the brick. That was the C case, because we removed the central chapel. Then someone said, oh, don't forget Mayor Donnie. He took it only up to the interior bearing walls because of the construction issues associated. That was the C sub 1 case. So we discussed 4 possible partial demolitions in the facade discussion. All of them are on the video, and we went through each of them. We said 3 things. Number 1, any use that we identified on a historical basis through the months of digging through all of that material could be used for both facade and for adaptive reuse. The difference being, in the facade, you had a new building behind. In the adaptive reuse, you use that in the existing building. That's a choice, a resident choice. So we didn't neglect the lack of wings. We addressed that. Then we addressed 2 other long-standing options. I want a rec center behind the building. Great. Not the first time that has been suggested. So we organized and put that behind and said, this is what that would choose. We then heard we'd like covered turf field. That went in. We're not making these up. And maybe we want a performing arts center. Great. Had you come, John, as I invited, and said, Frank, we would like to see demolition and a performing arts center there, you would see that. If you suggest it, we will present it. So the community has a choice. These are not our choices. These are your suggestions. Second thing that you seem to raise dealt with cost. Cost and estimation is a critical component, and I know our board is looking at it thoroughly, professionally, and with the right intent. I'm not worried about that. They'll take care of that. Whether or not you think that we should not combine demolition and use, that's a chance, that's a decision on your part. The board, however, said you had to consider 2 uses because that was part of a platform for the elected officials. Some sort of use or demolition. Not our choice, but that was our charge. As they said, maybe we want to think about the least expensive option. We might have said, do what we've done for the last 30 years, which was nothing. Leave the building there, put lights on it, treat it like a monument, the lowest cost. There was a nice remark I just heard, and it'll fall down. You obviously were not at the earlier discussion where our engineers went into the building with the Thornton Tomasetti report 2019, which was a second engineering report that said, despite the planned obsolescence and neglect by leaving the roof open over 30 years, this building has only lost about 3 to 5% of areas that would probably be demolished in any facade or adaptive reuse. Second, that as a result of the recently secured roof, this building, as any castle, will stand for some time. Despite the rumors, despite the photos, the engineers, one of whom is here, will tell you this building is not falling down anytime soon. And if the view of the residents, and thank you for this, is to put something in a park, something to be raised. Remember, back in the early 90s, this was supposed to have been a central park. Right? What happened to it? So what we're talking about now is where are the residents today? And the demographics of this community is different than 30 years ago. And so when we hear from residents, we put it out in the fresh and open air and allow the community to decide. We are not coming up with these uses as a committee. We are reporting what people have said to us. Some silly, not so silly, but unabated, directly from the community to you. I think those are all your 3 questions. And if you have a suggestion on that, come by Tuesday night, we're happy to hear it. Anybody else?
Yes,
Yes.
Frank, he's got the mic.
He's got the mic.
This is a question more for the mayor and for the trustees. We know that in the absence of just leaving the building as is, we're going to need an environmental impact study, no matter what. But we're not going to be launching that, undertaking that process now. Why would we do it?
Well, let the environmental attorney tell you what that might entail, because unless you have a focus on that CEQA process or EIS, you could be spinning lots of alternatives there.
Wouldn't the base approach to an environmental impact study be the same irrespective of what we decide to do with the building ultimately?
Just so I understand your questions, are you saying if you leave the building as is, do you need an environmental impact statement?
No, I'm saying assuming we're not going to do nothing. Now, if we are going to do something, we're going to need to undertake an environmental impact study. Why aren't we starting that process now?
So the basis for the environmental impact study would be the proposed project. Without definition of what that is, you don't know what you're evaluating. So that's why it wouldn't be prudent to start that process now until you know which direction the village would go.
Why? We wouldn't be looking at a sense with the same characteristics and qualities.
It would be a
Air,
fraud study.
water.
No, it would be a fraud study because you're not studying the project. You need to understand what the project is before you study it.
What is the project? What's the project? Why do you do this? These are the concepts that we're investigating. You have to reduce the size of the building. Once the choice is made,
And those members that we made in the commission were seen so in the environmental impact study.
that's enough. Usually it's a project.
I just hate to see us.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear you, Jack.
All right, we're at 9 o'clock.
Okay,
Close.
I have the mic, so I can just ask.
Bill?
Steve has the mic, he's been waiting patiently. This Steve.
Yes,
The other Steve.
the other Steve, this Steve.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Like the
All
other
right.
Darren.
The mayor has often mentioned the historical demolition and the various items of value in the building, and how it would have to be cataloged and stored. Does the village have a plan for these items, or would it make more sense to offer those items to the person who's going to come in and do the demolition, which would, I'm sure, lower the cost of the demolition if they were going to gain all the items in the building, with maybe the exception of a few things that the village might want to keep, the Tiffany glass, maybe some railings or something to use elsewhere in the village? What would the village do with all these tiles and woodwork and things that we would salvage from the building?
Well, you actually raised a good question, and what I believe our answer was early on was first we want to see what the value is of that, right? Second, we want to see that since much of the building brick could be ground down as an aggregate, what's the value of that? So that the people and the residents get a feel for what the real total value is before they look at the cost. So good point, and we agree.
Right.
Yes.
Hold on.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yes. My name is Leonard Young, I have...
Evan, put it closer to your mouth.
Oh. I have a company called Irreplaceable Artifacts and Demolition Depot. Many years ago, I was called in by a demolition company.
Excuse me, did he speak at a previous meeting? He's not a town resident. He spoke at a previous board meeting, raving about saving the building. He does not belong to this meeting this evening.
Oh, my God.
Yes, he does.
Well, I don't know of any meeting in the history of Garden City where we've allowed someone to be shouted down, regardless of where they were from, if they had a point of view to be heard. And in this meeting, I'm running it. This is not a question. This is not a question of whether or not you have citizenship or anything like that. This is an open forum for people who have expertise to add their voice. And on that basis, sir, we are going to allow him to be heard.
You're making a mistake. The mayor made a mistake letting you speak at the board meeting, and you're making a mistake now.
Devin, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm not what I said, right?
How many here are for open and honest discussion? Okay, we're adults, we can make our own judgment as to what we're going to do with anyone's comments.
Hold your mouth close to your mouth.
Okay, thank you. I'm not here to cause a controversy. I'm here to add something from my experience so you all can benefit. And I see it completely differently. And I wanted to offer that and share that with you because I see you're missing a lot of potential, in my view. And I've been at the other meetings. I went to the Historical Society last night. And I'm repeating myself just in the beginning, just for people who haven't heard me before. I think it's only courteous to them for me to start at the beginning briefly so they can understand the fuller scope of what I'm trying to say. Years ago, I was called in by a demolition company to evaluate the pieces for their benefit if they were going to get the job, and to help them live with it. Well, that's what I do for years and years, 49 years. I've been doing that, replacing pieces all over the world for new uses instead of them going to the landfill. I have a copy of my book that I wrote, and it's all about what we do. However, I fell in love with the building, and I figured, okay, the demolition didn't go ahead, that's fine, because I saw a better purpose for the building than getting demolished. And I'm sorry to redirect this meeting, but I wanted to at least say it, because I feel if I ask a question to everyone here, just an open question, would anyone object to not demolishing the building and not facadism if someone came up with a use that doesn't cost the taxpayer any money? Would there be any objection if someone comes up with a use and it doesn't cost anyone any money? Would there be a fuss? Well, I've been trying for a while and it just didn't seem to fall, but I think maybe it has the potential to possibly go in that direction. So that's why I'm here, because I have a proposed use, which I feel is the highest and best use, which will benefit everyone, and it won't cost anyone anything. So if anyone wants to hear about that, raise their hand. I'd be happy to tell them.
And then 5 minutes, we're after 9 o'clock, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. All right, I'll make it best I can. Anyone talk to me there, or I'll wait for my side. I have a proposed use, and that's, I've been involved with a lot of the trades that involve restoring buildings, replicating pieces, and putting buildings back into order so they can be reused. I'm involved with historic restoration for my entire career. This building is worthy of that, very simply, and it can be done just like they did in France. France has a program called La Compagnon. La Compagnon has 2,300 students. It's a school that teaches how to restore every aspect of buildings, historic buildings. Because France woke up and they said, look, what's our biggest revenue source? It's not Peugeot, it's not Renault, and it's not anything else they manufacture. It's tourism. Tourism is the highest dollar value for the country of France. Would France look good if there was no buildings there? Would they go to France if they saw Walmarts and Kmarts and all chain stores? No, it would be flat. So if France woke up and they decided, well, we got to do something about it. So we decided to take all our old professionals that know all these skills and teach it to the younger generations for future use so they could make themselves more valuable and place themselves in society where they can become useful and have skills that their predecessors and our older people that have
spent years developing, doesn't get lost. And it can be reused, and this building can be its first project, and it'll be restored by students and by people with professionals who have been doing it for their entire lives, teaching people how to do it. And that would be great because America has a lot of children buildings that can use people, because it's very hard to get anyone who knows what you're doing anymore. And this would be a school that would teach these people. And I feel that that's the highest and best use, it's the least invasive, and the businesses in the area will thrive, and the people that are coming, and I think it's all positive. That's my take.
Thank you, Evan. Now, Evan will be around and handing out if you'd like to talk in. Last question, we're going to give it to you. And then we're adjourned, and Bruce Torino will close.
Our plan violations.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Listen, thank you all for coming. Trustee Torino will close. Please remember, on November 16th, we will have a summation of historical use, on facadism, on adaptive reuse, and demolition. Village-wide, last town hall for the moment, and we'd like to make sure all of you return, invite your neighbors, and continue the dialogue. Tuesday night, until then, 7 o'clock at the Historical Society for those who would like to come and add their voice to the discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. And I bet you we can all agree that democracy is a messy process. How do we wind up having a decision made when you have this many people who have divergent opinions? One step at a time, in which we answer the fundamental questions of what direction are we going, how much is it going to cost us, and yet get as many people together that have a similar voice. So far, this process has taken 30 years. Most cattle drives don't take that long. And quite candidly, it seems that way, in which all the little doggies are going off this way, and some are going that way, and eventually we'll wind up in Dodge, and then have a party. But more importantly, it's going to be necessary to start the next step, and to answer the question of how much does it cost, so that we can factor in going down to the next fork in the road. And that's how we're going to have to have it done. All the options that are on the table remain on the table until there is a defining moment when the residents themselves say, this is where we want to go. I thank all of you for your participation. It has been an excellent discussion. We will see you at the next one.
Thank you both. November 16th, right back here in the middle school.